Hello and welcome to the Business Talk podcast. I'm your host Deepak. We are delighted to welcome Professor Georg Wernicke with us today. Professor Georg Wernicke specializes in corporate governance and corporate social responsibility, examining how CEO values and public opinion shape corporate behavior and reputation. His work explores issues like CEO compensation, corporate misconduct, and the impact of pro-social practices. Professor Georg research has been featured in top journals, including Academy of Management Journal, Organization Science, and Strategic Management Journal, and has earned multiple awards. Professor Georg is currently on the faculty at HEC Paris, where is the Diet Scores Foundation Chair Associate Professor of Strategy at HEC Paris and where teaches strategic management and continues his impactful research in CSR and corporate governance. Professor Georg Wernicke earned his PhD in management from the University of Mannheim and holds degrees from University College London and Humboldt University of Berlin. His PhD dissertation received the prestigious Oxford University Centre for Corporate Reputation Best Dissertation Award. Before joining the faculty at HEC Paris, Professor Georg Wernicke served as an assistant professor in corporate governance at Copenhagen Business School and held visiting scholar positions at institutes including NYU Stern School of Business, University of Antwerp, Northwestern Kellogg School of Management, and INSEAD. In 2023, he was the winner of the BNP Paribas One Teaching Prize at HEC Paris, reflecting his dedication to excellence in teaching and impactful learning experiences. In this episode, Professor Georg Wernicke shares valuable insights from his research, how business leaders can shape democracy responsibly, that has been published in the Journal of Business Ethics in 2024. Please join me in welcoming Professor Georg Wernicke to our podcast, where we look forward to gaining valuable insights from his expertise on the topic. It's a genuine pleasure to have you with us today, Professor Georg Wernicke.
Thanks for the invitation, Deepak. I look forward to the conversation.
Professor Wernicke, could you share what motivated you to research the role of CEOs in shaping democracy? And why do you believe it's essential for business leaders to engage in public discourse?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So this interest, now it speaks for itself, the motivation. We just had the election in the US. We have a coming election in Germany, which is my home country. And what we observed in the past in the US, and especially for the last election, and what we also observe in different countries in Europe, for example, is that business leaders, especially CEOs, are increasingly taking a public stance on often current social political topics or issues. So that usually goes under the term of CEO activism, right? So again, business leaders wading in publicly on current social political topics. That is a trend that we have seen increasing quite a lot in the US just before the first term or during the first presidency of the former incoming President Trump. And it's a trend that has spread through other countries, especially to Europe. And so the question I've asked myself is, how come that business leaders are publicly taking a position here? Because in the past, business leaders would usually abstain from taking a public position, right? Of course, businesses and business leaders would engage in politics through donation or through lobbying. But those practices are very different from CEO activism, so publicly taking a stance here. For example, lobbying is usually done in secret. So usually businesses don't want the public to know that they're lobbying for or against a certain law. But CEO activism is a very public act, right? The whole definition of it is that it is a public act. So they want the public or the population to know what is their stance on a current social political topic. And I found that A, very interesting, and B, I wanted to understand what are the motivations of business leaders to engage in such practices. So this motivated me to study the topic, and I still study the topic here. But for the research you were referring to, what we were interested in is more the normative aspect of this practice. So the normative aspect here is it good for society, and especially is it good for democracy if CEOs take a public stance here? Because they do get a disproportionate share of attention, one could say. So if Elon Musk, for example, tweets something, especially now that he owns X or formerly Twitter, it gets a lot of attention. So their opinion, their voice gets a lot of attention. So the question we were asking in this research is the way it is done right now, is it conducive for democracy, or is it potentially something that we might question from the perspective of how public opinion is formed in a democracy. So that motivated me to study this topic.
Very insightful. Professor, you argue that civic responsibility is crucial for CVO activism to positively impact democracy. How can CEOs ensure that their public stances prioritize civic-minded principles over corporate interests?
Yeah, so that's a very interesting question. So what we observe here in the practice is that some CEOs tend to use this practice rather, maybe for the lack of a better word, we could say mindful, right? So they wait in and only for certain topics. Maybe often these are topics where they have maybe some personal experiences with. Maybe they give voice to a group that is usually not heard. So it could be a minority or something like this. While we do observe some CEOs who weigh in on all kinds of topics, right? So the question here is, again, from a normative perspective, is the weighting in of people with such powerful positions who get so much attention, is it conducive to democracy or is it not? And again, there's no one answer that could classify all the acts of CEO activism. So we differentiate between acts of activism that adhere to certain standards of what we call civic mindedness, right? And certain acts of CEO activism that don't adhere to these standards.
Your research highlights integrity, responsibility, and a commitment to the public good as an essential quality for CEOs to and engaging in political affairs. How can CEOs cultivate these qualities within the context of corporate pressures and responsibilities?
Yeah, it's again a very good question. So you mentioned pressures here, right? So business leaders are under extreme pressure now, especially since this practice has become a bit more prevalent, to take a public stance on all kinds of topics, including violent conflicts that are happening all around the world right now. Yeah. So it becomes potentially very difficult for them, to take a stance without pushing one or the other side of the spectrum on a topic to criticize them, right? And it becomes increasingly difficult for them to abstain from taking a position, right? So basically, what we're suggesting in this research here is that certain qualities, for example, integrity, responsibility, commitment, or a few of the categories or the conditions that we mentioned, and we're going to talk about a bit later, can help CEOs also to decide when to take a public stance, on which topics to take a public stance, and maybe when to abstain to take a public stance. And it gives them some ability to also explain, maybe to an audience, of why they're not taking a public stance.
Could you elaborate on the 4 criteria: adding new insight, ensuring timeliness, fostering constructive dialogue, and maintaining transparency that CEOs should consider before making public interventions? And how might these criteria prevent social polarization?
Yeah, so what we offer in this research is, again, 4 criteria where we argue, okay, if you adhere to these criteria or largely adhere to these criteria, this is what we would call civic mindedness, right? So you're aware that potentially a business leader is aware that publicly weighing in on a current social political issue can have severe effects for how public opinion is formed. So we give 4 criteria here that we think if you adhere to that constitutes a civic mindedness intervention. So these are added insight, timeliness, constructiveness, and transparency. So let me explain the 4 factors here. Added insight. So here the idea is that if a CEO takes, or a business leader takes a public stance, voices an opinion, this opinion should contain information that has not been said in the conversation about the topic yet. So it's not about just saying I'm pro, I'm con, or the other side doesn't really know, or I know better. It's about new information that it added to a discussion that has not been discussed before. If I cannot add new information, then as a business leader, I could ask myself, why do I need to weigh in publicly on this issue? Right? If I don't have to bring anything to the discussion, anything new, right, or an aspect that has not been given enough attention, maybe I should reconsider if I should weigh it. So this is added insight. This is the first of 4 conditions. The second condition is timeliness. So when do I weigh in? Right? We have seen a few examples, especially during Brexit, the Brexit vote in the UK, that business leader took a public stance after the vote has been done. So after democratically, the voters have decided that they are pro-Brexit on a very small margin, given that, but the majority has decided pro-Brexit, business leaders came out. So here the question is, if I want to take a public stance, when do I do this? And our suggestion here is do it during the public discussion, before the vote is done, not after a vote is done. So this is the second criteria. It's criteria of timeliness of the intervention, right? Our suggestion here is, again, do it before a vote has been done, not after a vote has been done. The third criteria is constructiveness. So this is about the tone of how do I intervene and in which form do I intervene, right? I could use language that is rather strong. I could use a format that is very short. So maybe I could set a tweet with a very strong language, or I could use a language that is a bit more neutral, and I could use a form that allows me maybe to elaborate a little bit. Why am I taking a public stance? And what are the reasons for the position am I taking? Yeah? So here it's about the constructiveness. That is the third criterion. And it's really about the the tone of the position should be more constructive instead of confrontational, for example. Yeah? And the last of the four criteria is so-called transparency. And maybe we're a bit naive here, at least we have been called naive. But what we wish here is that a CEO or a business leader makes the reasons for taking a public stance public, is transparent about the reasons for taking a public stance. Is it because of the beliefs of the leader, the personal beliefs? Is it because of the personal experiences of the leader to weigh in here? Or is it maybe because it has instrumental reasons? It's important for the business. So there might be a regulation that interferes with how the business can be run, that affects the business, and that's why a CEO is publicly wading in. Or it could be because the CEO has some personal interest of why to wade in, right? So the idea here is that a civil-minded CEO adds insight to a discussion, enters a discussion before a public opinion has been voiced, for example, through a democratic election, is constructive in his or her tone, right? And is transparent in the motives for intervening in the public discussion. We believe if a CEO adheres or a business leader adheres to these four criteria, it can add actually new insights to a discussion. It can foster democracy. It can foster the exchange of opinions and views on certain issues in a democracy. But on the other hand, if a CEO does not adhere to these criteria, it could actually add or increase polarization. It could increase confrontational tone between different sides of a debate here, and is potentially not conducive to democracy.
With CEOs often becoming symbols of their brands, how can they balance their personal views with their company's identity in a way that respect diverse stakeholder perspectives?
Extremely interesting question. Almost impossible to answer. So even if CEOs don't want to become the face or the brand of the company, they might be seen as such. Yeah? So what we observe in the practice of CEO activism, that very often CEOs say, this is my personal opinion. I am not speaking on behalf of the company that I'm leading. But of course, in public discourse, that part is often forgotten if it's reported about or it's simply ignored. So you're absolutely right. Very often CEOs are the face of a company or the brand of a company. It is extremely difficult to balance these two. Now, here our suggestion is clearly to say very strongly and repeatedly that this is either a personal opinion or not. Yeah. Actually, very often we suggest that maybe even CEOs have, of course, the right to a personal opinion and the right to voice their personal opinion, that they maybe abstain from voicing their personal opinion. And again, this comes from the idea of a civic-minded intervention, that as a business leader, one is aware that one is giving an disproportionate amount of attention and maybe weight in the whole process here, so that sometimes not saying something is actually better for the discourse, public discourse, and in democracy on a topic than intervening here. But you're absolutely right. This is a very, very tricky question. If a CEO voices his or her opinion, it's very often equated with a stance that the company has, and vice versa. Sometimes a company states or takes a position, and it's often equated with the CEO's private position, even though the CEO might not be aligned with the position of the firm. Which brings me to the second part of your question here, diverse stakeholders. Now, some companies have rather non-diverse stakeholders, or stakeholders who are at least on certain topics align in their opinion. So Patagonia comes to mind. It's a small company. It's pretty clear who the employees are. It's pretty clear how the leaders think. It's pretty clear how consumers and employees think. They usually are, in line with more liberal positions. But if you're running a company as big as, I don't know, Walmart, Amazon, Google, Tesla, maybe, you have hundreds of thousands different employees, millions of different shareholders, customers. It's impossible that they all align on a political issue. It's impossible to do. So it's very difficult to balance the views and the interest of different stakeholders by taking a public position. Here again, what we suggest is maybe abstain from taking a public position here, or making it very clear that this is a personal opinion and not the opinion of the company or of the stakeholders, who might feel that a CEO, given that the CEO is often seen as the face or a brand of a company, speaks on behalf of certain stakeholders. So make it very, very clear that this is a personal opinion, or potentially consider abstaining from publicly voicing a stance.
Professor Wernicke, your study incorporates both liberal and Republican views of democracy. Could you explain how this perspective shaped the framework you propose for responsible CEO activism?
Yeah, so that brings me back to the discussion we just had. They're very diverse stakeholders, or among stakeholder groups are very diverse opinions. And sometimes they're as polarized as they are in a society here. And what we do in our article is we adopt two very important views of democracy here. There are more views, but these are two very important ones. One is the so-called liberal view, and one is a Republican view. These are not to be confused with the political parties, okay? So they're very different. This is political philosophy where they come from, so it's very different from the political parties of Republican and liberal or Democrats here. So the liberal view of democracy basically says that everybody has a voice, has a right to voice his or her opinion, as long as it's in line with the law. Okay, so and this creates to a what is sometimes called, well, in a nutshell, very simplified here, to a competition of ideas. There's different ideas that are voiced, and then the voter decides which idea is more attractive to the voter, and everybody can voice his or her opinion as long as it was in line with the law. Right? It's a very broad view of when it is okay to voice your opinion and is conducive to democracy. Now, this creates a few problems, and the biggest problem is that as a stakeholder, maybe as an employee, I am not agreeing maybe with the stance that the leader is taking. And again, maybe the leader is seen as the face of the company. So I'm being asked now when I see my friends, oh, is that your position? So a stakeholder, like an employee or a customer, might say, like, no, actually not in my name. It was actually not said in my name, right? But it might be perceived as such. So this is a big difficulty that this view of democracy has and creates. Now, the Republican view, and again, it's not the political party, but it's coming from political philosophy, says, now, in order to increase the civicness, the mindness, or civic mind, or it has the idea of civic mindness of a discussion. It says it's not enough that voicing your opinion is not violating existing laws, but there's actually more criteria that help a discussion to advance. And these are the criteria we had outlined here before, so that you add insight to a discussion, that the timing of when you enter a discussion is important. You don't do it after a vote has been done. You respect the vote, but you do it before. You try to add new insights to a discussion here. You try to have a constructive tone instead of confrontational tone, and you also are transparent about your motives of your position. So from the Republican view, it's not enough that you have the right to voice your opinion, that it helps democracy just to voice it, but basically there are certain conditions which should guide you whether and when and how to join a public discourse or not. So we're building on the latter view, on the Republican view, and suggesting these criteria that then allow potentially CEOs or give CEOs some kind of guidance when to intervene in the public discussion. And I think these guides are also important, not just for business leaders, but also for boards. So I'm speaking a lot with boards who say, well, sometimes, our CEO has a tendency to take a public stance where we're not sure this is really a good idea, or we're not really sure our stakeholders agree with that position. So we would have preferred maybe if the CEO would have not spoken out. So I think our criteria gives some kind of guidance to boards to decide maybe on some criteria when it's okay for the CEO to intervene in a public discourse, and when and how, versus when to abstain. So I think it fosters a discussion also to be more mindful about the disproportionate influence that such public influential people have, and is mindful of the way we form our opinion in a democracy.
Professor, you mentioned controversial actions by Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos. What specific lessons can other CEOs learn from these examples regarding the impact of CEO activism on democratic discourse?
I think that the judges are still out, right? And let's see, especially I think our article was published before the last election. So there were a few things that we could not foresee here. But in our view, at least in our model, the way that Elon Musk intervenes in public discourse is not very civic-minded. Yeah? So in our view, it violates more or less all of the criteria that we have here. And the fear, and I'm just saying it doesn't, I'm not saying it has to happen or it is happening, but the fear that we have that is not helping democracy. It's not helping the discourse to be less polarized. We find it sometimes not very constructive. There's value added, information added is missing often, right? The tone is, we feel at least often rather confrontative instead of constructive. The timeliness is surely there, right? But potentially what we observe in the US and also in many other countries around the world is an increasing polarization of political opinion. So that people on different spectrum of politics, but also on an issue, have increasing difficulties of exchanging arguments with one another, maybe finding a compromise, agreeing with another, political parties forming coalitions. These coalitions are increasingly unstable. And what we fear is that the way the public discourse is currently done increases the polarization. And unfortunately, we fear that some CEOs, the way they intervene, are not helping to reduce the polarization. Now, it might be rational and maybe helpful from the individual business persons, entrepreneurs, CEOs perspective. So maybe it's helping the company here. We call these instrumental reasons to engage in CEO activism, right? So maybe the company will have a better position, or the business leader has a better position that can help the company's business performance or share price here. But from the perspective of protecting democracy and discourse in democracy and the process of how public opinion is formed in a democracy, this practice might not be very conducive to that.
Professor, are there particular risks or challenges for CEOs when engaging in political or social issues? What might be some unintended consequences, and how can CEOs prepare for them?
Yeah, I think there are potentially unintended consequences. I mean, it's a very active area of research there. It looks like the results are all over the place. So what we can see is that potentially those stakeholder groups among employees, customers that disagree with the CEO's position are alienated. Those who agree with the CEO's position might pleasantly, like the position that the CEO takes here. But what we see is that negative reactions, so disagreeing with the CEO's position, potentially leads to a stronger reaction than agreeing or positive emotions with the CEO's position. So potentially what is happening here, that CEOs taking a stance on a social political topic are alienating parts of their employees, especially those who disagree with the CEO's position, who then, as mentioned before, feel like, oh, the CEO is speaking on my behalf, but this is not my position, so not in my name. But also that CEOs might alienate some of the customers that they have, so that customers feel like this is not, what I associate the brand with. So maybe I like the car or I like the clothes, but now this company stands for something I cannot identify with. And yes, maybe there's some stakeholders who agree with the CEO's position, but usually these positive emotion that this triggers, the agreement between the CEO's position and the stakeholders' position, are less strong than negative reactions here. Now, when we look at the stock market, shareholders most often usually don't like it when CEOs become entangled in politics instead of focusing on running the company. So although here, I think the judges are still out, but there is some evidence that it's not always positive if CEOs start being engaged in politics. Maybe it's perceived as not paying enough attention to running the firm. Maybe the firm is not doing well and it's a distraction. Maybe the CEO has some political ambitions, but shareholders don't pay a CEO to have political ambitions. They pay a CEO to run the company well. So the potential downsides, and I'm sure these are unintended, is the alienation of maybe shareholders, but also important stakeholders here. Now, as a last point is, I imagine that politicians are not very happy about a business leader interfering in political debates here. Sometimes they are happy, of course, if their position aligns with that of the stance of the business leader. But if it doesn't, they might perceive it as an interference in the public discourse here, right? We have seen some examples of, in Florida, for example, Disney, that has been, in a fight with the governor there in Florida. So potentially a company becomes entangled in a little fight with local politicians that might have detrimental effects, for example, for the taxes, for governmental contracts and things like this. So I think there's a lot of danger of engaging in those practices, also from a business perspective, beyond the normative perspective of potentially it's not really conducive to democracy here. And there's one point we haven't mentioned yet, but let me mention it here, is from the viewpoint of politicians, politicians are responsible to the voter. If we don't like them, next election we can kick them out of their office. Business leaders are not. I mean, they're responsible to shareholders, and if they own the company, then they're responsible largely to themselves. We cannot elect them or kick them out of office, actually, right? We could maybe vote with our feet and not buy their products anymore, but we don't have the stick of not electing those business leaders again. So the legitimacy, democratic legitimacy of business leaders is way less than it is of politicians that we can elect or kick out of office, right? So the question is, like, what are the checks and balances if we're not happy with the policy that are suggested with regards to business leaders here, right? This being said, let me add this here as well. What research also shows is there are sometimes strong reactions to a business leader taking a public stance, especially if the observer disagrees with the CEO's position. But usually these reactions are they don't last very long. So research suggests that, after a few weeks, consumers tend to forget, and, for example, consumption goes back to normal. So there is a stronger negative reaction if there's a disagreement with the CEO stance than if there's agreement, but it usually doesn't last too long. So we tend to forget quite quickly.
Professor, my last question. For aspiring leaders who wish to make a positive impact on society, what advice would you offer on the responsible use of influence and public engagement?
Yeah, I would say read our article, call me, and then we can have a chat about it. But most importantly, read the article and be civic-minded. So civic-minded basically requires a certain level of self-awareness. So develop that self-awareness. It starts with understanding that you have, as a business leader, you have an outsized influence on public opinion, right? If you say something, it usually makes the news. It gets a lot of attention on social media here. So with that influence also comes some kind of responsibility. And I think we need to be aware of this. Engagement should be deliberate. So again, I think our 4 criteria help there. You should be able to add insight. Otherwise, why intervene here? Okay. It should be timely. So it's, it should not be done after an election. It should be done when different viewpoints are exchanged here. It should be constructive in the tone. And the motives should be transparent. So all these goes under what we call deliberate engagement here. And the business leader should sometimes self-constrain. So I have the right to have an opinion, absolutely. Everybody has the right to voice his or her opinion, absolutely. But sometimes self-restraining that right and not intervening in a discussion, for example, if I have nothing to add, yeah, if it's after an election, then maybe it's better not to intervene and take a public position than to take a public position here. So it requires a lot from business leaders, especially awareness and sometimes the self-restraint of not voicing an opinion, which is a lot, but is also sometimes difficult to do because, of course, they're asked to take a public stance, increasingly so, right? Journalists call them up and say, what's your opinion? Voice an opinion. So here, I think it is important sometimes simply to say, now, my opinion plays no role here. We have elected politicians and they have a viewpoint. I can tell you what it means for our company, right? So if there's an increase in regulation, if there's deregulation, this is what it potentially means for our employees, for our customers, for our business here. But politically, I'm going to abstain from taking a position here.
Professor Georg Wernicke, it's been a genuine pleasure to have you with us today. Thank you for sharing your expertise and thoughts on such an important topic. We look forward to seeing how your work continues to influence the corporate world and democracy at large. Thank you once again for your time and insights.
Deepak, thanks so much for the invitation. It was a pleasure.
Thank you.